Israel has put in the public domain images of babies killed, babies massacred, and also shared these images with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. We're continuing to look at the geopolitical impact and also the human cost of Israel's retaliation against the Hamas terror attack. A terror attack in which horrific new details are emerging every single day. After a ferocious global debate around the claim that babies were beheaded, Israel today released images and also shared some of the most macabre images with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who confirmed at a press briefing that he had indeed seen images that included images of infants that had been riddled with bullets and soldiers that had been beheaded. As Israel gets set to unveil its retaliation, concerns are also mounting about the humanitarian catastrophe that could unfold in Gaza. There is a total blockade of Gaza, and Israel is demanding that for that blockade to be lifted or diminished, hostages, at least 150 of them still in Hamas custody, should first be released. To talk about all that is happening and that could happen, we're very pleased to have with us today on the program Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer is joining us from New York today. Ian Bremmer is with the Eurasia Group. He leads the Eurasia Group. He's a political scientist, an author, and an entrepreneur, and an expert on global political risk. Ian, thank you very much. Appreciate your making the time.
Sure.
Thank you. Let me start by asking you why you think the world has been so fixated on the manner in which babies have been killed in the Hamas terror attack. That children have been killed is not in doubt. We have all seen videos, in fact, several of them, which show children cowering in fear as a sibling is killed right in front of their eyes. We know now from the Washington Post that there are at least 9 children that have been taken captive by Hamas and so on. Now you have Israel releasing very, very graphic images that we cannot show on this program, but that images that have been shared with the United States of America. What do you think the impact of these images is going to be?
Well, I mean, the one you just shared is graphic enough, really. I mean, I don't even want to share that on my social media account. It's so dehumanizing. This is the worst violence that we have seen against Jews worldwide since the Holocaust. So I do think you have to put it in that unique context. 6 million Jews systematically singled out and killed in the most horrific ways by Nazi Germany. And we promised as humanity, never again. That would not happen on our watch. And this week, we're confronted with a failure of, I mean, we don't need to point fingers because there's plenty of responsibility to go around. But the fact is that Hamas is a terrorist organization. And they have done the most unspeakable and brutal things to Israeli civilians that they're going to be living with for generations. And so that's why I think the response is so extraordinarily raw and ugly. And unfortunately, that is also going to define a good amount of the retaliation that you will now see from the Israeli Defense Forces into Gaza.
I'm going to get to what happens in Gaza in a moment, but let's talk about the failure that the world is confronted with. Israel too, maybe this is not the moment that Israelis can talk about it, but any number of them that I've been speaking to are hopping mad with Benjamin Netanyahu. And there is something to say there. There's also the accusation that his policies were responsible for strengthening Hamas.
Well, I will tell you, there was a poll that just came out in the last 24 hours from the Jerusalem Post, which is hardly a left-wing publication in Israel, that showed that 80% of Israelis blame Netanyahu for the failure to stop these attacks. I mean, look, if you're not going to think about the Palestinians, and I've done a lot of talking about Israel over the last year, and the focus has not been the Palestinians. The focus has been judicial reform, unprecedented internal demonstrations inside the country, the potential for a constitutional crisis, corruption cases, all the rest. The focus has not been on we've got to do something about the Palestinians. And if you're not going to do anything about the Palestinians, if you're going to bottle up the Palestinians in Gaza, 2.3 million people. And if you're going to take more and more land of the Palestinians in the West Bank, expand illegal settlements, which of course has been the policy of Netanyahu's far right-wing government, coalition government, then at the very least, you better ensure that your intelligence, your border security, your security forces are crack solid, are not letting anything happen on their watch. And this has been the unprecedented failure of Netanyahu. The situation for the Palestinian citizens getting worse and worse, and they completely took their eye off the ball. I mean, not only were they not focused on the Palestinians, but a lot of the troops that were defending the southern border with Gaza were moved to the West Bank because of the expanded settlements and the Palestinian reprisals against them. I mean, no question that if you want to talk about where there were failures, a big piece is going to be reserved for the present prime minister.
Well, let's talk about what happens next. I think, as you said, and I think you said this on Twitter as well, the price is going to be paid by stateless, poor Palestinian civilians who may not have any political sympathy for Hamas, but are too terrified they are caught between a rock and a hard place. And yet Israel would argue that at this point, we have the absolute right to retaliation. Where do we find that space? And Blinken spoke about this today. He said the Israelis have a legitimate right to retaliation, but we need to work on possibly a humanitarian corridor. What do you see happening?
Look, the reality is that the Palestinian civilians, just like the Israeli civilians, have the right to basic security, have the right to basic standards of living. And those rights have just been abrogated for thousands of Israelis. And now the Israelis are going to mete out that violence and much more against the Palestinians. There's already been announced a siege against Gaza. And that means no electricity, no food, no water from Israel is getting through. A lot of Palestinians are going to die as a consequence of that in hospitals and the rest. And that will be considered a war crime by the United Nations, by countries around the world. I saw 11 UN workers over the last 48 hours were killed in Israeli airstrikes. That will be considered a war crime. Now, the Israelis, I don't think the Israelis would argue that they have a right to kill Palestinian civilians. I don't think they'd make that argument. I think what they would say is they have an imperative to do everything possible to defend the Israeli people, and that comes before concerns about Palestinian civilians. I also think that they would say that Hamas intentionally endangers Palestinian civilians, in part because they operate in civilian neighborhoods, in civilian buildings, precisely to make it harder for the Israelis to take them out. They use civilians as human shields. Essentially, Hamas is not just holding 150 Israelis and other nationalities hostage right now, but they're also holding 2.3 million Palestinians hostage by virtue of the terrorist attacks that they engaged in against Israel. And, the danger here, of course, is that this is a trap for the Israelis, that if the Israelis go in, as I expect they will, with ground warfare, and they blow up, we already have over 300,000 people displaced and homeless in Gaza with nowhere to go, and with shelters overwhelmed and hospitals overwhelmed. And it's going to get much, much worse with ground warfare conditions worse than Fallujah in Iraq when we talk about Gaza City. That's a trap for the Israelis, who will lose enormous support from the Arab street across the region, that over the last years were increasingly comfortable with the idea that you could normalize relations with Israel. There will be more anti-Semitic attacks across the region fewer Jews will be welcomed. Their security will be at risk. This is precisely what Hamas wants to see happen. They want to radicalize not just Gaza Palestinians, but Muslims across the region against Israel, where the Palestinian issue had been becoming a marginal issue that was not of relevance, as you had the Abraham Accords, as the Saudi-Israel deal was coming down the pipe, as you saw other things taking priority over the rights of the Palestinian people.
So do you believe, therefore, that in the retaliation or the form that it's likely to take, Israel may be walking into a trap set for it by Hamas?
Of course I do. I think that, let's keep in mind that Hamas is not going to be around to enjoy the spoils of that trap. This was a suicide plan for Hamas leaders. They will be killed, and Hamas militants will be disarmed and either jailed or killed. So it's not.
But many of them are in Qatar, safely ensconced.
Yes. I understand. Not the majority. The fighters are primarily in Gaza, and they do not have a future. They are dead enders. It's kind of like Prigozhin and the Wagner leadership on their way to Moscow. Like, once you make that decision, you're not there for long. And the long arm of Israel, I mean, you will remember, there have been targeted assassinations in the UAE, for example. I mean, even in Qatar, if you are seen as responsible for terrorism against Israel civilians, you are not safe going forward. And the Americans will help with that. Let's be clear. But in terms of the broader region, yes, if you go to war against a monster, you cannot become a monster yourself. And Israel is in danger in the coming weeks and months of being perceived as a monster as well. That is, of course, that has to be the biggest danger. The blood is boiling right now for any Israeli civilian. The demands of all the families. How could you let this happen? How could our children, how could our grandparents be killed? How could they be held hostage? I mean, this is the fundamental component of the social contract. And the Israelis shouldn't have been surprised. It's not like living in New York as I was before 9/11, and the Americans thought that we can walk down the street anywhere and it's perfectly safe. In Israel, they've been surrounded by enemies since independence. Like, they get the fact that there are terrorists, operating just outside their borders, and that the top priority for the government's to protect them. So again, I fear that the level of hostility, the pain, the emotional anger is now going to lash out in ways that will make some Israeli decision makers forget who they are. And I worry about that, Barkha.
So I wrote those words down as you were saying them, and I'm just going to read them out again. If you go to war against a monster, you cannot become a monster. And let's keep that on the screen for a moment, because I will ask you, and Israelis would ask you, what are our options, Ian? Are you really saying, as a country, given what's happened to us, we should not retaliate? And if you think the way we're retaliating is incorrect, what is the other way to retaliate?
Well, look, I think that Israel has every right to destroy Hamas. Every right. I fundamentally believe that. I believe that after 9/11, the United States had every right to destroy Al-Qaeda. Every right. And I'm not someone who wishes for death, but when bin Laden was killed, I was happy. And that's a reality. That's a reality. And this is a guy, of course, the Americans had worked with historically. So he was a creature in part of America's own building and mistakes. This happens, right? And so if this is Israel's 9/11, and much worse, frankly, given the size, of Israel and just how many people in the country it has directly touched and affected, their friends, their family members, their community, much, much more so than 9/11 in the United States. They have every right to retaliate. But, Barkha, I think it is a mistake to engage in a siege against the entire population of Gaza. I think it's a mistake to target the 2.3 million people of Gaza, even if Hamas is responsible for that. I think it's a mistake for Israel to allow that to happen. I think that Israel has to do everything in its power to limit civilian casualties. They have to work together with the United States and Egypt to provide the ability for a safe route of passage for innocent Gaza Palestinians to get out. Not anyone that wants to leave, not militants, but certainly you can imagine children, women, the elderly, the infirm, let them get out of Gaza. Find a way. Right now, there isn't such a way. That needs to happen as well. I mean, the Israelis they don't target civilians. They do send leaflets to buildings to let people know that they need to evacuate before they bomb. I mean, Israel is not the moral equivalent of Hamas or ISIS and will not be. But there's a very big difference, Barkha, in this environment between doing the minimum and doing the maximum. And the lives of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and I'm not overestimating that, literally hang in the balance here.
And therefore, you're saying that before the Israelis go in with a ground incursion, before they sort of continue further with this sort of blockade of food, fuel, even water, before they do indiscriminate air bombs, there should be a way to get women, children, elderly, at the very least, who are ready to leave, out of Gaza.
And aid into Gaza from the UN, through Egypt, from other countries, through Egypt, to ensure that hospitals have what they need to take care of people. And again, I understand that Hamas makes that more difficult. I understand that Hamas has not made it easy, that they're more than happy to take any dual use goods and use them for their own military purposes at the expense of the Palestinian people. This is going to be made harder by Hamas at every step of the way. But I'm telling you that if you are Israel, the only saving grace here, is that Israel is not facing an existential threat to their nation. They can defend themselves. They failed because of the Netanyahu government, because of the short-sightedness, because of the selfishness of the Netanyahu government. But they have the weaponry, they have the training. They have just mobilized an additional 300,000 Israelis for the army. And there are young Israeli men and women from all over the world that are voluntarily flying back to Tel Aviv to fight. This is not like in Russia, where the Russians engage in a mobilization and all of the cars go the other way, Barkha. Hundreds of thousands streaming, getting the hell out of that country because they don't want to fight for the Russians. Everyone with an Israeli passport is prepared to sign up to defend their nation. So, I mean, that's something the Israelis can be proud of, but it also allows them to be better, allows them to be more human, to be more humane, allows them to remind themselves that not all Palestinians are terrorists. I mean, there is a moral equivalence between an Israeli child and a Palestinian child. They're the same. They're the absolute same. And any of them that are killed in battle, it's a tragedy. And the Israelis know that. Hamas does not care, but Israel does. Israel does.
How much pressure do you think the Americans could apply at this moment to Israel to ensure the kind of humanitarian thoughtfulness that you are referencing?
I think America can be helpful. I think America can engage diplomatically with Egypt. They can provide financial support. They can marshal that support from other countries. They can leverage that. I will tell you, Barkha, I think in this environment, for the near future, it is very hard for the Americans to put pressure on Israel, not least because there is such bipartisan outrage in the United States for all of these horrible images that President Biden was just shown by Netanyahu in their conversation, that Secretary Blinken was shown in Israel meeting with Netanyahu, that all of these images that you're seeing on social media and in the mainstream media, it is very, very hard for the Americans to take a step back and say, no, 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 Israel, here's what you need to do. I mean, I'm an American, but I mean, I'm speaking to you as a political scientist who's done this work for 30 years of my life. It's much easier for me to say, here is what I think should happen. Here's my understanding of what's happening on the ground in Palestine. Here's what my understanding of what's happening on the ground for the Americans. I think for an American political official, which I am not, that is a much greater challenge.
Let's talk about Iran. I know we have just a couple of minutes left with you, but let's talk about Iran. Do you think this conflict is going to include Iran?
No, I do not. I think it's very unlikely. I think the Iranians do not want it to include Iran. Now, of course, the president and the supreme leader both applauded in just a criminal and inhumane way the Hamas attacks. They called for genocide, the end of Zionism, but they also said they weren't responsible. U.S. intelligence confirms that they weren't aware, at least in these early days of the war. But more importantly, Barkha, Iran's own actions in past weeks and months show that they were not looking to start a war with Israel. In fact, they've moved in the opposite direction. They were looking with Oman to open talks with the Americans. They let 5 American citizens go that were being held prisoner illegally in Iran. They reduced their uranium enrichment levels and their stockpiles and allowed international inspectors in. They opened relations directly with Saudi Arabia, and the Iranian president just in the past 2 days had his first ever public conversation with Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, and they both called for an end to the violence. These are not the behaviors of an Iran that is about to roll the dice on entering a war with the Israelis. And let's be very clear.
But sorry, could this assault have happened without Iran? There are a lot of Israelis who believe that it's a military-grade invasion.
I don't think that this assault could have happened without Iranian military support of Hamas. And Iran has historically provided them with significant humanitarian aid, money, and weapons. By the way, Hezbollah much more so, and Hezbollah is far more capable than Hamas. So yes, I do believe the Iranians are complicit. That is very different from saying the Iranians were aware of the specific plans of the attack. And I certainly do not believe that they orchestrated the attack. The idea to me that Hamas leaders would have gone to the Iranians and said, hey, is it okay for us to attack the Israelis? Like, no, I don't believe that for a second.
Finally, Ian, this is such a polarized debate around the world. You spoke of bipartisan sort of outrage in the United States of America, but as you know from your own commentary, there are very few people like you who are able to call out the Hamas for being a terror group, but also call for not punishing innocent civilians in Palestine in the way, or in Gaza, in the way that Israeli civilians had to suffer at the hands of Hamas. I know that you said that you've been facing threats even for taking the position that you have.
I have faced a lot of death threats over the last few days. Almost all on Twitter, X, because it's a enormously dysfunctional space. But you know, Barkha, when you say you don't think there are many people like me, I strongly disagree. I actually think most of the world is like me. Most of the world looks at an Israeli civilian and a Palestinian civilian and doesn't see a difference. Most of the world doesn't have a strong tribal preference towards one or the other. But political leaders and influencers do. And they are magnified by social media. They are magnified algorithmically in an environment that makes money and profits off of human pain and anger and anguish. And that's the problem, is that we are seeing an erosion of civil society because of the way that information is disseminated. And that needs to stop. That needs to be regulated. That is the single biggest problem we have in our democracies today. There are others. There is inequality and there are identity politics and all that. But the single biggest problem is social media driving hatred, driving misinformation, and making humans dehumanize other fellow humans. And I refuse to be a part of that. I will fight against that for my last breath.
Thank you for saying that. I couldn't agree with you more, and thank you also for finding sort of nuance and complexity and a kind of position that speaks the truth on both sides of a seemingly irreconcilable debate, and pointing out that a lot of people would commonsensically approach it the same way if social media did not magnify, reward, and amplify hate. I'm sorry about the death threats you've been receiving. I know what it feels like. Thank you, Ian, for speaking your mind. It's always a pleasure. One learns so much.
Good to see
you,
Barkha.
very much.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you. Take care.
Good stuff. Great to see you. Okay, I look forward.
Bye.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.